Thank you all. And welcome to the San Diego Museum of Art guest lecture series. This lecture is part of the San Diego Museum of Art Friday guest lecture series and brought to you by the docents of San Diego Museum of Art. Today's lecture will be followed by our traditional after lecture tour led by our docent Marina Khan. She will be highlighting and discussing the Cam Gardner exhibit, which unfortunately, as you all know, we cannot just visit just yet due to the closure of all the Balboa Park museums. Today's lecture is by Scott B. Davis, and the title is Every Mile Fell a Shadow. And please remember that in the chat function, let's see, here we go. In the chat function, you'll be able, over here on the side, you'll be able to send comments and questions to Scott. Hang on, here we go, there we go. I lost you for a second. So then today's chat room is being curated by Mary Grillo, who will share the questions and the comments that you ask with Scott at the close of this lecture. First of all, I want to thank all the wonderful docents and volunteers who've made this presentation possible, to Scott B. Davis, who patiently worked with us to bring you this presentation, and of course, a special thanks to David Miles. I wanted to briefly share something because we were talking about it during the patter section. Something that's actually going on in photography just down the street here, and that's with the City Heights Youth Foundation. It's a photography project which highlights the works of young residents of the City Heights neighborhood to document their community life experiences. These young and creative youth are using the medium of participatory photography and storytelling for a tool, as a tool for change, and just to talk about their existence in the community. You can go online. Here it is. Here's the slide that David has supplied for us. City Heights Youth for Change. It's the AJA project, and they are visually responding to the topics that they've chosen, which is education, law enforcement, cleanliness, and another one that I've forgotten. Here are the faces of the young individuals, very active in their communities, changing the perception of City Heights and tapping into their own creativity. Well, on to the lecture. Since the 1990s, Scott B. Davis has worked with large format cameras and platinum and palladium process, the process of platinum and palladium, try saying that fast several times, to explore the edges of photographic sensitivity. His approach is rooted in a deep technical understanding of darkroom processes and a unique interest in photography's history. Incorporating photographs of extreme darkness and light, working with in-camera paper negatives, and employing experimental darkroom formulas, his multi-panel works are knockout reinterpretations of the Western landscape. Scott has been fascinated with the desert landscape since childhood. After relocating to California in the 1980s, he began making photographs of those wilderness corridors and urban spaces throughout the American West. Scott is based here in San Diego. He creates his art in landscapes from Mexico to Los Angeles and the complex and diverse Sonoran Desert. In today's lecture, Scott will share his work with fine art photography and describe how he transitioned from creating straightforward landscape photographs to the abstract, non-representational work he is known for today. He's drawing his talk to you today from the works of the Masters of Photography, the Garner Collection. He will use the history of photography and his own work to present an enriched understanding of photography's evolving position in the field of fine arts. Please welcome today's lecture, Every Mile Fell a Shadow, and our lecturer, Scott B. Davis.
Thank you so much, Bea. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I am proud to be broadcasting from the neighborhood of City Heights, where the Aja Project is located, that you mentioned, and also on ancestral Kumeyaay land. And I want to thank the Kumeyaay people for allowing us to be residents of their land and to create the work that we do here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and get the lecture underway. As Bea mentioned, the title of the lecture is Every Mile Fell a Shadow. And this is a great opportunity to share the evolution of my work and my influences throughout the history of photography. It's in conjunction with the exhibition, the current exhibition at the San Diego Museum of Art, which we look forward to reopening soon, called Masters of Photography, the Garner Collection, drawn from a large and rich collection of the works by the photographer and collector Cam Garner. I want to start by thanking Bea Barraza and David Miles of the Docent Council who helped organize this lecture, as well as Jim Grebel and the Docent Council itself. I'm also grateful to Dr. Stephen Doros, who first suggested the museum talk to Roxana Velasquez, and is the reason why I'm presenting the lecture here today. I'm going to go through a quick survey of my history with photography, and I'll move through that a little bit quicker and finish with a bit of a deeper focus on the present, because I want to give you all a sense. Let's see. And you're still seeing my screen? Great. I want to give you all a sense of how I arrived at making this non-representational work that Bea described in the introduction. And so I'm going to start way, way back. As a small boy growing up on the Eastern Shore, not far actually from Washington, D.C., about 20 miles outside of the district is where I was raised. And as a boy, I had an obsession with the American West, as you can see in this picture from July of 1979. If you could zoom in, or if you can see the shirt that I'm wearing, it actually says Houston, because at the time I thought Texas was the American West, and I loved these ideas of being out there. I eventually found my way to the actual American West, and I relocated to Southern California. And it was in the 1990s that I started my involvement with photography, which has really been a love affair that's lasted to this day. And I started using these large wooden view cameras, as you see me here in this picture outside of Borrego Springs in California. I was really, really drawn into photography through the work of Ansel Adams, and I'm not ashamed to say that. You know, Ansel's gone through these kind of ebbs and flows of popularity in the history of photography. And his masterworks, like this work in the exhibition, as well as this one, really taught me this idea that artists are messengers and that we have a story to tell. And so as I began to create my own work, I was really interested in making quotidian pictures about the natural world, really based on my interest in the diverse landscapes of Southern California. These natural landscapes that don't suggest the shopping malls or beaches or palm trees or blue skies that we come to associate with Southern California. And a lot of these early works looked like other people's pictures, but they helped ground me in a thorough technical understanding of photography. I was inspired by the pictures of other artists that expressed different views and different ideas about photography, such as this work by Mark Klett from 1983 called Car Passing Snake, shot in the eastern Mojave Desert. Or a little bit deeper into history, this work, which is also in the exhibition, simply titled Eleanor, by the Chicago-based photographer Harry Callahan, who made photographs using large view cameras, much as I do. And this is a picture of his wife. It's a figure study. And it really inspired me to think about the powerful sense of minimalism that's possible in photography. I learned about photographers like the New York-based artist Hiroshi Sugimoto, who suggested a connection to nature without ever leaving the city that you call home. And I myself began looking at cultural histories of the landscapes that were immediately surrounding my home. I was drawn to the desert pretty quickly. Again, this kind of goes back to a boyhood fascination with just open spaces in the American West. And I started to be drawn to these ideas of making the subject the smallest part of the picture that I could, thinking about it as pushing the idea that maybe the subject could be 1% of an entire photograph and still hold your attention, such as this jack-o'-lantern that I found in a desert wash in the 1990s. By the late 90s, I left Southern California and I moved to New Mexico to attend the renowned photography program at the University of New Mexico. And one of the first places I went at that time was to the Trinity site, where the world's first nuclear device was exploded in 1945. This is open twice a year, and I was really fascinated with these tiny figures in the landscape who were looking for the fused earth. It's a substance known as trinitite. It's all been cleaned up. It's a foolish effort for these people to try and find it, but I was really drawn to this human interaction in the landscape. And it was around this time that I discovered the platinum palladium process and started to find a more unique voice for my work. And that voice was really based in process, this kind of hand-created print that just demanded more involvement from me, the photographer, than simply buying a product that I could buy at the local camera store and make darkroom work with it. There's beautiful examples of platinum prints in the exhibition, such as this remarkable gem of a 4-inch by 3-inch platinum print by Carl Struess. Interestingly, this was made in La Mesa, which is not far from my home, not far from our home in San Diego, if indeed you're watching in San Diego. I knew what most people did with platinum, which was making photographs that were very symphonic in their tonal range, and really emphasize these subtle high key tones and the subtle shadows that were possible with the print. This is another work in the exhibition by William Dassenville, shot in Yosemite Valley in 1905. Like many artists, there came an aha moment in my work, and it was the time that I processed this sheet of film. This is an 8 by 10 inch sheet of film shot in the desert near San Diego. And what I expected versus what I got really transformed my way of thinking. I was really interested in how people interacted with the landscape, but I thought that by setting up my camera here and making a night exposure, I would capture some sense of the landscape. And what I actually captured, of course, is the distant cities that surround these remote desert locations. And so this really inspired a kind of curiosity about the world that I hadn't thought of before. To give you a sense of what this place looks like and what I thought I was going to capture, this is a picture of this same spot from the same vantage point with the same horizon line, or the horizon lines are lined up here. I thought I was going to capture this sort of phantasmagoric landscape, and what I captured was this beautiful minimalist study about how people interact with this landscape, because in reality, out where the sun is rising, there are thousands of people who live and work out there. It was a reminder to me that to be a successful artist means that you need to be curious and you need to stay engaged with the materials and the processes that you use. And this really led me to the earliest bodies of work that I was defining my own voice with. I was interested in pushing this photographic process of platinum palladium printing in a new direction, using the matte surface of the paper and making images that captured a sense of minimalism and also the experience that I found in the landscape. This was shot at Georgia O'Keeffe's home, the Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. And it was at this time that I felt like I was beginning to make photographs that no longer emulated the people who I was looking up to. I always look up to people in the history of photography and I'm always inspired by it. But this was the first time that I felt like I was really expressing my authentic voice. And it was around this time that I began to realize the question that I was really trying to answer, which was, how can we tell new stories of the American West? How can I, as an artist, describe this familiar space to many people photographically in a way that didn't look like the photographers that had come before me? And so I continued on this path, and I wandered around the New Mexico desert at night and deserts of the American West, really exploring the world with a sense of discovery that was familiar to photographers such as the 19th century photographer Timothy O'Sullivan, who were really engaged with a sense of discovery. O'Sullivan had traveled to these same areas in New Mexico as part of a US Geologic Survey project that took him out there to document these foreign and strange lands. And this reminded me that these photographers who were making photographs 100 years, 120 years before I was, meant that I was really walking in the footsteps of giants. And I wanted to pay homage to that. And so I began making photographs in places that figured prominently in the history of photography, such as Inscription Rock in New Mexico. All this work continued for many years. These were all contact prints made with an 8x10 camera. They were all printed in platinum palladium. And for me, it made me think about new challenges. And the new challenge, first and foremost, was how would I make bigger prints? And that meant building a bigger camera. And so this began a multi-year process. This idea of building a larger camera began a multi-year process, which, interestingly enough, I almost forgot this until one of our prep discussions for this lecture, that I built this camera in the basement of the San Diego Museum of Art. At the time I was working there as an exhibition installer, and my boss knew that I had this dream, and he said, look, you're welcome to come in any day before work. You can come in as early as 6 o'clock when I arrive, and you can do all the woodworking you want. But at 8 o'clock, you're mine. And so I built this camera in the early morning hours in the basement at SDMA. Again, I realized I was walking in the footsteps of giants, because other artists, such as Chuck Close, have used these unusually large cameras to do portrait work. And this is a Polaroid 20 by 24 inch camera that was used by many, many artists throughout a series of about 30 years, including Mary Ellen Mark. And the Twins exhibition that's on view at the museum right now is all a series of 20 by 24 inch Polaroids that Mary Ellen Mark created of identical twins. The local San Diego photographer, Tim Mantuani, undertook his own project with this camera, making photographs of legendary photographers holding their own iconic works of art. So these are photographs of photographers holding photographs. So this here is a legendary skateboard photographer named Grant Britton. This is actually a picture of Tim holding a print of Grant's, with Grant standing beside the camera. Tim Mantuani also photographed Mary Ellen Mark and a number of other notable photographers throughout this project. So these are all unique 20 by 24 inch Polaroids. So it reminded me that I was not alone, but I still needed to learn what I was going to do with this camera. I really was not interested in repeating the work that I had done in the early days in New Mexico with the 8x10 camera. And that ultimately led me to beginning a series of photographs in Los Angeles. And it was in Los Angeles that I started to apply a minimalist aesthetic to a city that was filled with iconography. And so this was its own kind of journey to explore a city that was not home to me, but a city that so many people have associations with, whether it's through television, movies, media, the music industry. We're familiar with this city in our own ways. And I wanted to present a different view of it. I wanted to present a view that embraced minimalism and also told a story about this city. Photography is adept at capturing icons and stirring our imagination. This is another Carl Struess image from the exhibition called Brooklyn Bridge Nocturne, shot in 1913. You can see it's about a 4 by 5 inch platinum print that was made in a city that also is filled with iconography. And as I put this lecture together, I thought it would be fun to compare some of these works, to look at the similarities and the differences, to look at two photographs of icons shot almost 100 years apart, to look at two prints reflecting the times in which they were made. The scale of each of these prints is really making a statement on the era, the preciousness of a print at the turn of the 20th century versus the sort of grandeur of a 16 by 20 inch platinum print at the turn of the 21st century. Both of these are celebrating achievements of human engineering. You know, one is this fabricated place called Hollywood that's a very real place as well. The other is the Brooklyn Bridge. But both suggest a way to see familiar icons in new ways. But the real goal of this project of photographing in Los Angeles was finding the ordinary and appreciating these quotidian icons as images that describe a city in a new way. This is a work from the exhibition as well that I think is one of the best examples in the history of photography of celebrating the quotidian landscape. And it's George Tice's iconic mobile gas station shot in 1974 in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. It was fun to think about my work in the larger arc of photo history by putting this lecture together and being reminded of my own influences. Of course, I'm not thinking about these works as I'm out making photographs. I'm really, I think, dealing with this knowledge of the history of photography in a way that comes through. I think my brain is a kind of catalog of these because I love the history of photography and its sort of rich and varied landscape of looking at artists through time. This is probably my singular favorite work from almost 10 years of shooting in Los Angeles. It's a picture of an ordinary building on an iconic strip, an iconic street, the Sunset Strip or Sunset Boulevard. This exhibition also in the exhibition, this photographic print also in the exhibition, there's another picture of an ordinary building on an iconic street. It's Paul Strand's Wall Street from 1915. Strand printed this both as a platinum print and as a photogravure, which is what's in the exhibition today. And I had never even thought about these two works together until I put this exhibition, until I put the lecture together. But as I was looking over the exhibition checklist and really considering the works, it dawned on me that these strong kind of brutalist concrete forms have a kind of resonance together. And again, they're connections made in the history of photography almost 100 years apart. But the work was really about revisioning Los Angeles and not so much engaging with the history of photography, but just thinking about how LA as a city has so much to celebrate, these everyday icons. And suggesting parts of the city that aren't normally celebrated, like a parking lot on the UCLA campus. As I mentioned, I shot this work for about 10 years in Los Angeles. And like any artist who engages in a project for a long time, I started to get itchy feet. And I was reminded, or I am reminded often, of a quote by Minor White that reads, "The camera records superbly, it transforms better." And this really brings us to the present in terms of my work. I realized as I was continuing to make work and continuing to be engaged with the platinum palladium process that I had amassed a great reserve of technical skills. I have a video that's going to explain this process a little bit better because I think it's important both for your understanding about how I work and also your understanding as you view the exhibition works. And I'll share that in just a minute. I also had this knowledge of working with unusual cameras, such as this large 16 by 20 inch view camera that I built and other cameras as well, 8 by 10s, 11 by 14s, 4 by 5s and others. And I didn't want this knowledge to go to waste. And I re-engaged with this idea of curiosity. And I started with a simple question, which is asking, what could I do with the slow nature of these cameras and platinum printing to create a new body of work? And I thought, well, what if I put a sheet of platinum into one of these cameras rather than working with this material in the darkroom? What if I worked with it in the field? And so I'll share the video with you. And it's about 3 minutes, and it's an explanation of my work from the studio to the darkroom itself. The works that came out of it before I show the video were works like this. So this is a paper negative on the left, shot on the 16 by 20 inch camera, and then a positive print on the right. This was shot on film. This was shot the way photographs have been made almost since the beginning of photography. And this photograph was really a gift. It was a near accident that this even came out. I wanted to make an image of a desert plant and I wanted to split it to literally divide this plant as a positive and a negative. And part of the fluke of this is that the film, the image on the right, was fogged. It had light leaks on it. And those light leaks presented a whole different way for me to think about printing in the darkroom and to think about this medium as a very high key medium, as something that was filled with potential. So I went further down the rabbit hole and I started to think about how we perceive landscapes and how we see them and how this photographic process could be part of that. And then I really started to think about combining the two, about making night photographs, such as the photograph on the left here, which was shot on film and then printed traditionally in a darkroom, and pairing those with in-camera paper negatives, which is the image on the right. So I'll share the video with you to talk about this process of making these works.
The process of making my
Oops, forgive me. There we go.
The process of making my work can be broken down into 3 distinct production steps. The first step in my process, before I begin making photographs, involves work in the studio with traditional platinum palladium printing materials. These consist of light-sensitive ferric oxalate and a combination of platinum and palladium in liquid form, following formulas that date to the 1870s. Using cotton rag paper specifically designed for platinum printing, each sheet is carefully hand-coated, ensuring the paper receives a smooth, even finish of the platinum and palladium salts. It is hung up to dry for approximately 1 hour. Each sheet is then carefully trimmed to fit inside of the corresponding film holder. These are loaded in daylight, much as photographers have loaded film in complete darkness for the last 130 years. The paper inside each film holder will remain sensitized for approximately 1 to 5 days, depending on atmospheric conditions such as heat and humidity. It is here where the real work of photography happens, and for me, it begins with the processing of each paper negative. These are handled one at a time due to the fragile nature of these unique prints. I process all of my platinum palladium prints and paper negatives in 120-degree potassium oxalate, a developer that is never thrown away and over time becomes dark with accumulated platinum and palladium salts. The prints are cleared in a series of warm clearing baths, removing all of the unused light-sensitive material. After a thorough wash, each paper negative is set to dry on a screen in the darkroom. The next step includes processing of the sheet film, which is done in complete darkness. This is probably the most economical part of the process, as many sheets of film can be handled simultaneously. The last part of the process comes with a traditional printing of each negative. This involves placing a negative in contact with sensitized paper, exposing it to intense ultraviolet light, and processing that print following the same methods used for the paper negatives. Once again, each print is processed in potassium oxalate, cleared, washed, and hung up to dry.
So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the work that goes into the making of these, and also the kind of unusual process of making both paper negatives, film negatives, and then film positive prints. And so this work began really in earnest in the year 2013. And it started with pairs of paper negatives, occasionally pairing a paper negative with a positive print, such as this vertical piece called Ocotillo, Arizona Upland. And it really started to teach me to think more like a painter in how I approach the landscape, because I was no longer seeing the landscape in the literal terms of the photographer, where left is left and right is right. You'll notice that the mountain range on the top paper negative here is reversed from its counterpart on the bottom. This is, of course, the same mountain range, but photography inherently reverses things much like our eyeballs do. Our brain, of course, undoes that and tells us that the world is not left for right and top for bottom, but cameras see that way. And so the paper negatives are always laterally reversed left to right. And I found that this really opened a lot of ripe possibilities for how I would see the world. In this case, the negative space between these two objects, between the negative on top and the positive on the bottom, really became one of the defining dynamic parts of this particular piece. I also became interested in the fact that I could create fictions from the landscape. So this is two photographs of the same plant, shot from different angles and positioned in such a way that it looks like a contiguous landscape, but represented through a night photograph and a photograph shot in the bright light of midday. As I started to think this way and really started to revision how photography could be used as a creative medium, I began to sketch ideas before I would go out into the field to photograph. And so I would think about ways that I could represent the landscape as a place that was very familiar to me. I could envision photographs that I wanted to take before I was out in the landscape. And so I began to make drawings of things that I wanted to then make pictures of. And so I would sketch out, a very sketchy little drawing like this of 5 panels, one of which would be a negative, 4 of which would be night photographs, and I would eventually come home with a work like this. And this process really involves thinking creatively in the studio and engaging the studio as part of my process, and then going out into the landscape and literally finding what it is that I want to photograph based on the ideas that I had sketched out. So by pursuing those ideas in the actuality of physical space and having a great familiarity with this physical space, it's really created a very unique and different way for me to approach photography as a whole. Works like this was made earlier this year near Santa Fe, are reminders to me that there are still ways to revision the American West. There's still ways to revision the landscape. And going back to some of my earliest work and thinking about asking questions and not letting go of that simple curiosity of what's possible with any medium, in this case, photography, is really what's driven so much of these ideas. James Baldwin put it beautifully by saying the purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers. And that's really how I've started to approach photography, is to think about ways that I can represent familiar spaces. So these are 2 photographs made from a few miles apart. This was made again in New Mexico earlier this year. These are made of the same landscape, but they're 2 radically different exposures. Both of them, I'm sorry, are made from film negatives. They're printed in very different ways, but by moving myself physically in space, these 2 mesas that I photographed collapsed onto one another. So if you look at the print on the left, there's clearly 2 mesas visible, and moving down the road, they start to reshape themselves. And so these ideas of just playing with the landscape and thinking of it, like I said, more like a painter, are really what drive the work that I do today. Thinking about how we can see familiar spaces through a new lens, through new ideas. And it was really the limitations of working with a singular process and pushing myself by remaining committed to that process that encouraged me to expand the way I thought about it, and the way I thought, well, how can I even depict, in this case, a single mountain peak? The Western landscape has been photographed extensively over the last 80 years. And to push those ideas into places that engage with my thinking, with sort of new curiosity and finding new solutions is really what drives so much of what I do today. This is the work by the artist Jean Mili. He's an Albanian artist, and it's a multiple exposure. And multiple exposures have really started to figure prominently in my work as well. And so when I see works like this, I feel really excited by the way other artists have chosen to depict something through singular photographs or singular exposures in this case, depicting the same thing through repetition and the power of repetition in form. And that's what's really great, of course, about being exposed to new artists, being exposed to exhibitions such as the Garner Collection exhibition, is that you see these ideas that are as old as photography themselves and that overlap in beautiful ways. It's a reminder that history is alive and it's always overlapping all of our work. Much of the work I do today are also double exposures. And I do these, this is a double exposed sheet of palladium paper. So it's a double exposed paper negative. And I do this by simply removing this light sensitive material from its film holder, turning it around, reinserting it, and aligning the landscape in such a way that these two gaps, or peaks as they appear, overlap and form a kind of focal point that is an abstraction of a landscape. It's an abstraction of something that is fundamentally literal. I'm also reminded of Ray Metzger's use of multiple exposures, again, on a single sheet of light-sensitive material. This presumably was done in the darkroom. I don't know, and I don't care to know. I love the mystery of work like this and the way that artists play with abstraction. Or this one, which is in the exhibition, called Double Frame 66 HT 3940. Don't know what that means either, and I love the mystery of it. It's just, it's a welcome way to stretch my brain. I've been playing a lot with double exposures myself. This piece is from 2 years ago. It's called Two Nearly Identical Ridge Lines. These are two 10-inch by 8-inch. The one on the left is a platinum palladium print made on 2 sheets of film. And the one on the right is a palladium paper negative. This, again, is a double exposure. This is a complete fiction. These are not nearly identical ridge lines. They are, in fact, the exact same ridge line. This interest in fiction has really been driving a lot of this work. And it's been driving the work, too, to think about these symmetrical plants that exist in the desert. You know, the desert is such a stark landscape that it's easy to find symmetry in these plants and easy to realize that opposite sides of a plant produced reading correctly, such as the film negative on the left, or incorrectly, in other words, laterally reversed left to right, such as the paper negative on the right, allow an ability to create a different kind of fiction about the landscape. It's an illusion, and I love creating these visual puzzles from these landscapes that I photograph again and again. I want to share a specific example about the understanding of one place. And I want to share this in the context of my work to help you understand the way my mind works and the way I engage with photography. This is a place in Arizona that I frequent. It's a place that I go camping and return to again and again. And I've realized that places like this and these layered experiences of returning to these places inform my creative practice. This is a place that I visit year-round, in the summer, in the winter. I've seen it in different light from month to month and from season to season. And the familiarity has become part of my consciousness. And it's allowed me to develop a deeper understanding of the possibility of creating abstract works in this landscape. So this is a pair made at that location, at the same place that I showed you the color photographs of. And it reminds me of the Minor White quote, "The camera records superbly, it transforms better." This was also made in that same spot, as was this one. And this circles back to this idea that I've been thinking more like a painter and less like a photographer. I've really just been thinking about the landscape in the most kind of open and curious and creative ways. So this photograph is of this landform. And you'll notice that in the paper negative and the positive print, these platinum prints in the upper left, that the mesa is backwards. And I mentioned that photography, its native state is to laterally reverse the world. The paper negative, which is on the right, so that in the artwork up above, I'll go back to this, you have a film positive, or a positive print made from a sheet of film on the left, and then a paper negative on the right. The paper negative is almost the identical photograph as the film, the print from film, but it's been inverted to continue this illusion of positive space made at the location that you see in the color photograph. I've thought a lot about the separation of positive and negative space and how these also can form visual puzzles and form different ways of seeing the landscape. These are two 8 by 10 inch photographs that have been trimmed. They're 3.5 inches by 10 inches each. These were also made in the same spot. These are not photographs of the mesa in the color picture below. But it was interesting when I started to look back through these color snapshots that I've taken on location and to come across this one and to see that shadow on this landform, and to realize that these experiences are now part of my consciousness. Again, this is not a picture of the same landform, but it's really uncanny to see how these experiences are informing the work that I do. This is also a work made at that same location called Raven Butte. This was made earlier this year after the pandemic shut us into our houses. I needed to get out, and I went back to this place in early summer. So these are two photographs of a massive landform that defines an enormous landscape, and it's reduced to two 4 by 5 inch rectangles. So a platinum palladium print from a film negative on the left and a palladium paper negative on the right. And I'm reminded that scale is really one of the most powerful tools in abstraction. And as I was putting this talk together, I was thinking a lot about the work of Ray Metzger, not only because he's a big influence to me, but also because he's one of the artists whose work is included in the exhibition and has been really influential to me. And I started thinking about this piece in relation to the previous work that I just showed, and how Ray Metzger was also playing with both scale and negative space in this work. And I'm reminded how the work of all artists is part of a continuum, that we internalize the histories of any given medium and take them out and approach the world with our own unique voice. Like I said in the beginning, Ansel's work taught me early on that we're messengers, that we have messages to carry, and that when we articulate that in ways, it helps us communicate that to other people. So all of this work is currently in an exhibition at the Catherine Edelman Gallery in Chicago. This exhibition is on view through the end of the year, through December 31st. It's a big exhibition, and it's unfortunately far away from us in San Diego. I know we have people in the audience from Chicago. The gallery is open. So if you're able to travel, or if you are in that region, it's a great opportunity to see some of these works in person. But I want to end with a recent work that I made. And this work is made from literally a handful of sand that I carried home from the desert on one of my trips after the pandemic started. And we're living in the middle of a historic moment. And it's changing all of our perceptions about the world at large. It's changing our practice as artists. My practice is shifting, and the way I think about representing landscape has shifted as a part of this. And so it's a reminder of the infinite possibility of photography, and that we all carry spirit that's going to get us through this time, through creative means or otherwise. Before we take questions, I wanted to share various ways that you can reach me. My website, scottbdavis.com, my Instagram, Scott with a couple of underscores, B Davis. The museum website, if you're not already familiar, if you're watching from afar, sdmart.org. The gallery website, Edelman Gallery, and Medium Photo. I put that on there. It's a nonprofit organization that I founded and that I run. It was mentioned in the literature put out by the museum, so I wanted to share that. But I also wanted to thank everybody for joining today, and we can turn it over to questions.
Oops, there I am. Thank you very much. Yep, right here. Thank you very much for that. Was incredibly insightful on how you work with your equipment. And I was wondering, given the size of your equipment and all the equipment you need for this process, how do you travel with it? How do you get from one point to another? And how many cameras do you take with you at a time?
That's become a common question, and it's a good one. I have a pickup truck. I've driven a pickup truck since before they were hip, and they're necessary to me because I fill my truck with camera gear and food and a place to sleep. And I usually bring about 5 cameras with me when I travel, and it's kind of embarrassing because it's a real it's quite a setup, and it makes it much preferable to just sit in one place for a long time, which is antithetical, I think, to a lot of how people want to travel. When people travel, they want to see new vistas, new landscapes, and I want to stay in one place because it's such an investment to get there and to unpack all this gear. But yeah, I travel with a lot of cameras and I use them a lot, and it keeps me really, really busy.
Okay. We have another question here. What could you tell us about the role of framing in your most recent work?
Yeah. I think that's probably the most fundamental question to this work. And it has taken me from the rigid history of photography, which is to say the rigid history of using large format view cameras, which are very precise tools. They're not spontaneous. You're not going to photograph a sporting event with a view camera. And so it's brought about this kind of very structured way of seeing the landscape. And for me to start thinking more in a creative way that is what I call mind expanding, it has broken that frame, and it's afforded me the freedom to turn my camera at a 45-degree angle if that's how I want to represent the landscape. Or like I said, to physically just invert the print, which is something that photographers have done throughout the history of the medium. But it's a liberating tool. So the framing of them is, it happens in the studio, it happens in the field when I make the work as well.
Could you, the title of your presentation is very poetic. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so the title is Every Mile Fell the Shadow. And that title is drawn from a book by Colin Fletcher. The book is called River. And he began, in this book, he describes traveling the length of the Colorado River from its origin to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico. And as he entered a space called Desolation Canyon, which was named on the Powell expedition in the 19th century, he described this journey by saying every mile fell the light, because the light kept collapsing, right? The canyon got deeper and it was more and more and more shadow. And I realized that for me, because I'm dealing with long exposures, most of the exposures that I do are upwards of an hour in the desert in the middle of the day, that for me, it's the antithesis of that journey. It's every mile fell the light, you know, or every mile fell the shadow, is the antithesis of his quote, every mile fell the light, because I'm dealing with light, and the shadows are kind of receding away.
Thank you. Do you have a favorite place in San Diego that you like to photograph, or places?
I hardly ever photograph in San Diego, and I hardly ever photograph in Los Angeles anymore. Yeah, the places that I prefer to photograph are places that are really, really remote. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is I get into a headspace in remote places that just allows my mind to think more freely and openly. And also, quite frankly, I love not being around people. I love living in cities. I value people. I love my community. But it's really nice to just get away and to unplug. And, going back to the earlier question about how many cameras and how I travel, when you pull out 5 giant view cameras that, have these hoods over them and bellows, I mean, people naturally want to ask questions, and I love answering the questions. And a lot of times I'm, photographing and there's people around and they ask questions and I answer them. But sometimes the questions can be overwhelming. When somebody sees this ridiculous setup with these antiquated cameras out in the middle of nowhere. So I don't photograph in San Diego very much.
Okay. And are your works unique pieces, or do you make additions with variations?
That's a great question. They are all unique works, and so there really are subtle variations. Sometimes I showed 3 different pictures of saguaro cactus where the cactus has a different background. It's sort of laterally reversed. I guess you could call this variations, but the works themselves deviate, and this kind of goes to the thinking like a painter and less like a photographer. Photography, of course, is an infinitely reproducible medium. There's a number of photographic processes that are not reproducible: daguerreotypes, tintypes, etc. And working with these paper negatives and making the paper negatives an integral part of each artwork means that work is inherently unique. I cannot reproduce it. There's a film negative component with most of the works, or many of the works, that would be reproducible. But I see these paired images, whether they're diptychs or triptychs or 5-panel pieces, I see them as being married to one another. They are part of a whole. And so those film negatives have no use for me. Once it's been printed one time, it's relegated to the file cabinet. And I have to say, working as a photographer, that has been one of the most liberating changes for me, is making a work of art and just moving on. I don't have to go back and reprint it. The earlier work, all the night photographs that I did in Los Angeles and New Mexico, those were editions, traditional photographic editions. They were usually editions of 10. In the later years, when I started making these larger 20 by 25 inch prints, I was making editions of 3 with those, because it's nice to move on. And I saw a question earlier about the size of the camera.
Yeah.
And if there was a 20 by 25 inch camera. No, that was a kind of hot minute period where I was making these extremely large platinum prints. And those were from digital negatives, which were scanned from 8 by 10 inch sheets of film. So I was using sheets of film and enlarging them, using digital technology to then make a large platinum print. So the largest camera that I use is 16 by 20. Yeah, I had to think about that for a second.
And do you have a favorite artist that uses the concept of fiction in their photography?
That's a really, really great question. I think all photographs are fiction. We like to think that they depict reality, and in truth, they don't. I think the person who comes to mind the most is a good friend, a man named Richard Larn, who lives in Phoenix. And his work is, I think of them as their own kinds of fictions. So.
Is he a photographer?
He is, yeah.
And you speak about thinking like a painter. And
Right.
I was wondering if you have any favorite painters that influence your work.
Yeah, I do. I think Agnes Martin is probably the one that always is with me. Agnes Martin said, when you sit on a stone for a while, you can see my paintings. And I love that idea of just being able to sit with something and that its answers will reveal themselves over time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions that? people
Yes, I have a question.
have? Okay, Chao Wei.
Yes, is there any limit of the size of the camera? Can you make it as big as you want, like make it into a house that you can live in there?
Yep. You can. If you build a camera that's the size of a house, you either have to move it or be content to make pictures of wherever the house is pointed. There are photographers. There's a photographer in Britain named Richard Leroyd, who he has built these room-sized cameras that shoot sheets of film that are 50 by 80. That's 50 by 80 inches. And he makes giant contact prints from them. And there's a Cuban artist, Abelardo Morel, or Abe Morel, as he's known, who turns rooms in houses into cameras. He literally will black out the entire room and allow a small hole in the blacked out portion of the window to project a vision of the world outside. And he does this in iconic locations around the world. And they're really, really remarkable pictures. And they're presented right side up, but they are presenting the view of a camera, which is upside down. Those are really worth looking at. So there is no limit to the size of the camera. There's a limit to your budget and the size of film or paper that they make.
In that case, you can make it mobile, and then you don't have to carry all this big equipment. Just put in a motor and drive it to the location.
Yeah. Yep. There's a photographer in San Francisco who has I think he's currently in Budapest, but he's made a career. His camera is a trailer on the back.
Thank you.
His name is John Chiara.
That's great. Are there other questions? Anyone else?
There's a question about future plans.
Yes. Oh, there it is. Yes.
Boy, it's interesting because, like any artist, my head is brimming with more ideas than there are hours in the day. And one of the things that I really enjoy about this work is pushing this process to the point where it really becomes a fundamental question of, is it a photograph? Which is to say, I've made prints that are almost white on white, that have such a thin trace of information to them that they look like pencil drawings. And those are really interesting to me. They are not really interesting to the world at large, because when you show somebody a virtually white piece of paper, if their eyes don't glaze over, their head turns somewhere else and they look at the next thing. But I've started to draw on photographs, to apply graphite directly to photographs. And it's it's an extension of the process and what the process has taught me about pushing it to this idea of almost looking or feeling like a drawing, to me then actually engaging with the act of drawing.
Wow.
Yeah, looking at it that way. So
yeah. So you have created founded a nonprofit called Medium Photo.
Yes.
Could you explain the mission of that, and are there any upcoming events we could support? Or
yeah, so the mission is simple. The mission is to foster awareness and understanding of innovative photography. I mean, that's literally the mission of the organization. And the organization functions largely in two ways. One is we hold an annual festival when there's not a pandemic. That's held at the Lafayette Hotel in North Park in San Diego. And that is a weekend of artist studio visits, of artist lectures. We take a bus trip to artist studios in Tijuana, in Mexico. And we also do a portfolio review event where photographers literally come from around the world to meet with curators who also come from around generally North America for us, to meet with photographers and share their work. There's a lot of free events that happen in conjunction with it. The next festival will be virtual. It happens in early March. The official dates are the 3rd to the 7th, though we will probably expand that a bit to into the virtual sphere. But it will start with a keynote lecture by the Los Angeles-based photographer and artist Catherine Opie, and that takes place on March 5th at 7 p.m., which is a Friday, and it will happen virtually.
Great.
We also teach workshops to photographers as well. So it's a year-round endeavor.
That's great. Okay. All right.
Scott,
Well,
there's actually Hilda has one quick follow-up question, I think.
Sure.
Hilda?
I think that was answered, wasn't it? Right, Hilda?
Well, it's answered by what you discussed about your project. But I was just wondering, how do you teach this to the next generation?
Yeah. You know, I teach this to the next generation by encouraging people to think creatively. And that means different things to different people. You know, I get a lot of people who ask me how I do what I do. And I'm happy to tell them. But you know, that's it. It's like if Wolfgang Puck hands you a recipe and says, "Go make, you know, this meal," it's not going to be a Wolfgang Puck recipe. You know, there's individual artists bring something to what they create that comes from their heart and comes from their mind, and we all have something different to share. And so I just really encourage the next generation of artists to think about what's important to them and what medium is the best way that they can transmit that information and that inspiration.
Okay. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Well, we can't thank you enough. That was just a fascinating presentation, and we really enjoyed it. And you can tell from the number of questions. So thank you very much. And I hope everybody will stick around, because now we have a tour by one of our more recently graduated docents, who is on her way to becoming one of our most accomplished docents, Marina Khan. And she will be giving us a tour of some of those photos in the Cam Garner exhibit that we can't see right now, but it should whet your appetite. Marina?
Hello, everyone. I'm here. So let me share my screen first. Would like to welcome you to the virtual tour of the Masters of Photography exhibition. And as you already know, it highlights the photographic collection of Cam and Wanda Garner, who are very dedicated supporters of the San Diego Museum of Art. So these very important works of art are illustrating exceptional developments in the field of photography for the last 1.25 centuries. And from the very early time, photographers were determined to claim the status of high art for photography. And here's an interesting quote: "Whether photography is or is not a fine art is no longer a question. It is." So declared William Edward Dasonville in 1902 in one of his lectures. Now let's see how this proclamation was reflected in his own photography. So I would like you to just have a look at this beautiful platinum print. It's called Yosemite Valley, and it was taken in 1905. And although William Dasonville supported himself with the commercial portraiture, his interest lay in nature, as you can imagine. And in this print, we can really see that beautiful rendering of the Northern California land. It's like an Eden on earth. Notice the variety of mountain shapes, the haziness of the atmospheric perspective. It looks very dreamy, very inviting. So his soft focus landscapes were very much in line with the pictorialist style. The pictorialist style was very popular at the turn of the century. And the pictorialist photographers, they try to make their art, their photographs with very harmonious compositions. And they emulated paintings in order for their prints to be considered as fine art. And a couple of photographers familiar to you, I'm sure, Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen, they were founding members of the photo secession group, but they were also they were just so fond of this style. So their earlier works were in the pictorialist style. And they also worked very hard to establish photography as a fine art. During World War I, there was a shortage of the supply of platinum printing paper. And Bessenville had some skills as a chemist, and he created his own paper. He called it a charcoal, and it was very special in terms of the texture. It was emulating platinum qualities, like the platinum printing paper. It was very velvety. And he called it charcoal, as you see here, is the cover of the folder which contains some papers. And there was a writing at the bottom, so I enlarged it right on the bottom right. You can read it. And charcoal became very popular among pictorialist photographers. That for a time it was a very commercially successful production. And Bessenville even had to close his portrait studio in 1924 to solely focus on manufacturing his own brand of paper. So Bessenville used soft focus and a delicate tonal range to idealize his subject. At the same time, his contemporary captured his subject matter in a very sharp focus. Louis Hine was hired as a photographer in 1906 by the National Child Labor Committee. And at that time, he was already established as a sociologist and a photographer who photographed immigrants and skilled workers in Pittsburgh. So he was very noted as a photographer. But at the turn of the century, very few questioned the horrifying conditions children were working in for as little as 15 cents a day. So he was hired to actually document children working in various industries. The goal of these investigators was to open the public's eyes to the exploitative nature of children's employment, and also to help ignite legislative change to end these abhorrent practices. So Hine and his colleagues, they traveled across the country investigating, documenting, meeting, and photographing these children. And very often men in charge of the factories or mills would refuse him entry, and he would have to disguise himself pretending to photograph fire escapes or machinery. And when an overseer would get bored and quit, then Hine would start taking photographs of the children, very, very often making notes secretly in his pocket while interviewing them. And this is perhaps how Hine met Sadie Pfeiffer. He encountered her at the cotton mill in South Carolina. At that time, she was 8 years old and 4 feet tall. She had already worked at the mill for more than half a year. She toiled 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And notice how he photographed her right next to this giant, dangerous machinery that she faced each day. And you can imagine this beautiful light that she's bathed in, although she perhaps had no time to stop and observe it. So it's a very compelling and compassionate picture of a young child. Her small form is nearly overwhelmed by this rows of spools in front of her. The repeating form evoke the monotonous and mechanical nature of factory work. So images like this, like Sadie's photograph, they were appearing in periodicals and posters and in booth at the anti-child labor conventions. And although the effects were not always immediate, the appalling scenes that Hein captured with his camera, they succeeded in drawing attention to the plight of children in the workforce. And Hein's hunting photographs of children like Sadie, they represent one of the first instances of photography helping to enact social change. Louis Hein was deeply respected for his strong sense of commitment to the betterment of our society. The following artist, Hein's student, also used power of photography to generate public awareness and influence social change. Paul Strand was born in New York City, and he was introduced to photography at the New York City Ethical Culture School. And his teacher, his first photography teacher, was Louis Hein. In 1907, the camera club, the school camera club took a field trip to a very special place. It was a gallery, for the Secession Gallery, that was funded by Alfred Stieglitz, and it was located at 291 on Fifth Avenue. And the works in the gallery would move Strand to take his photographic hobby more seriously. And 9 years later, in 1916, he had his first one-man show. It was called Photographs of New York and Other Places, and it was located at the Stieglitz Gallery. So let's have a look at one of the photographs that was part of that project, and it remains today one of the most famous works of Paul Strand. And at first, the subject of this photograph appears to be an urban landscape, but there is more to it. Strand took this photograph from the steps of the New York Federal Hall during morning rush hour. And the recently completed building of white marble, which looks a little grayish here, very imposing, it was located on 23 Wall Street, and it was located in the most expensive real estate area in New York City. So it looks like a symbol of financial power, and it was, in fact, it was the building, the new headquarters of JP Morgan. So here, the tiny people who look just kind of abstracted silhouettes, they are walking in front of the building, along the building, and notice their long horizontal shadows trailing the human silhouettes. Those horizontal shadows, they are counterposing the vertical, very imposing black rectangles of the windows of the bank. And also, you can feel that solidity of the building. It's almost like kind of a ominous feeling there on the street. And here you can see the early experimentations of Paul Strand. You could see, of course, the geometric patterns and structures. You can also see the high contrast, the perspective, and the minimal composition. So all these elements were part of a trend of the pure or straight photography, which was emerging in the early decades of the 20th century. And it was opposed to the pictorialist imitation of painting. So you can sort of already discern that straight photography had an inherent value of realism. And that was the goal of Strand, to convey that realistic scene that he saw in front of him. And in this ominous air, there's a feeling of very uneasy relationship of the early 20th century Americans and their growing cities. And we have a sense also where Paul Strand's solidarity laid. He was very politically intense and left-leaning. And uh, in quite young age, he was already expressing his um, sort of empathy to the workers, working class all over the globe. In 1930, he helped to establish the Photo League. It was an association of photographers who used their art to promote social and political change. And eventually, his organization was deemed subversive. And to protest government harassment during the McCarthy period, Paul Strand left the United States in 1950, and France became his home until his death in 1976. So Strand's Wall Street um, seems very somber. So the whole urban landscape with presence of these people seems somber and realistic. Let's witness how another photographer saw the same city. Berenice Abbott. She was frustrated by commercialism and politics, and at the same time intrigued by the artistic and literary circles of Paris. And in March 1921, she sets her sail for France. And during that time in France, she is getting versed in sculpture and writing, drawing, but it is until she started working for a famous surrealist photographer, Man Ray, that's when she learned how to make photographs. And 3 years later, in 1926, so she started working for him in 1923. 3 years later, she became very involved with the portraiture making. And she took many what now considered are famous photographs of James Joyce and Jean Cocteau and Peggy Guggenheim, amongst others. And it was a successful project. And just emboldened by her own success, she decided to go out on her own. And she returned to New York City in 1929 with an enormous project in her mind. So she decided, with the support of the Work Progress Administration, she decides to photograph the changing nature of New York City. So she wants to document the modern metropolis. And this photograph was part of the project and today remains one of the most widely recognized images of New York. Now, I have a question. So how would you describe this photograph? Perhaps you would say it's exhilarating, breathtaking, romantic, luminous, and the list of descriptions may go on and on. And personally, this is how I would like to embed the night, nocturnal New York City in my mind. It's a stunning print. Abbott took this photograph from an upper floor window of the Empire State Building in late December 1932. And she waited for this twilight period when thousands of street lights and office windows, they blazed in this symphony, electrified concert for a very tiny period of time. Basically, it was between the winter solstice sunset and the 5 o'clock time when the lights would go off. Now imagine Abbott high up in the Empire State Building. She's just prepping her camera, the view, very bulky wooden camera, and she waits for 15-minute exposure just to capture that exuberance below, that glittering, boundless cityscape below her. And darkroom magic aside, here is this beautiful triumphant print of night view. And it looks, on one hand, very futuristic, and it looks actually as futuristic to us in the 21st century as to those who were her contemporaries, um, you know, depression-weary contemporaries. So life wasn't that easy in those years. And yet she is celebrating New York City. And also, this photograph looks realistic because we can map the streets, we can recognize all the buildings, they're all anchored in time. And in addition to that realism, it also remains just an utterly, artistic print. It's like one of the examples of fine art in photography. And it also makes us feel what she saw and felt right there on top of Empire State Building. So you may still feel enchanted by all those heavenly lights scattered across the nocturnal Manhattan sky. Let's see what light can create at the terrestrial level. Flo Garduño, Mexican artist, she confessed once that photography was not her first love because she liked drawing. She was planning to become a painter. While pursuing her art degree at the San Carlos School of Fine Art in Mexico City between 1976 and 1978, she met two masters of photography who would change her life. So one of the masters was an expatriate Hungarian photographer, Kati Horda, who explored surrealism and feminism. And another master was Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who was considered and still today considered as the Latin America's most significant artist associated with the surrealism. Surrealism was the movement exploring the subconscious. And for 2 years, she trained with Alvarez Bravo. And by the way, his two photographs are presented at the exhibition Masters of Photography. And I believe one of his photos are on the front of the catalog of the exhibition. And so he trained her in technical skills in the darkroom, and also imparted the intangibles that are necessary for to a person to become a photographer, so to become a serious artist. And then in the 1980s, she gets a job with the Mexican government, traveling across the country, going to rural areas, photographing the areas for the use in textbooks. And during this period, this early 1980s, she discovers her own style, and I would like us to see if we can distill it in one of her works. So this is one of Garduño's, one of the iconic images of Garduño, and it shows an indigenous teenage girl balancing a large basket of freshly cut lilies. Can you imagine that fragrance emanating from the basket? All those beautiful, radiant flowers appear to glow from within. And those who are familiar with Alfredo Ramos Martinez, Calla Lily Vendor, 1929, may recognize the inspiration behind the Garduño's photograph. So as you see, the subject matter of both works is identical, showing local flower vendor, with each artist choosing to elevate the role of the street merchant. While Martinez shaped the canon of the muralist art prevalent in the Mexican art in the first half of the 20th century, Garduño explores the interdependent nature of light and shadow. Her image looks very multi-layered, and she's kind of stretching those boundaries of working in black and white. And her palette is very extended. Her blacks can be graphite or inky or kind of grayed. Her whites are very lush and very rich, soft and fuzzy. And I only hope the computer screen can convey just a tiny bit of that, of the quality of her image. But otherwise, it's spellbinding if you spend more time looking at it. The luminescence is just creating almost like an emotional response and inviting us to ponder the subject of this print. What is it about? Is it about, a female essence or life of a woman in this planet and this earth? Or maybe it's about a daily life or a harmony or completely something completely different. But what is wonderful about this print is that kind of underlines that feminine essence, and it becomes just time transcending. So it just belongs to any time. This print stretches the frame of time. And Flo Gardunya takes her images. They are very familiar subjects, as you see, and she provides them with poetic titles and then imbues the images with alternative meanings. And the following photographer creates replicas of classical works of art, but with alternative materials. Here's Vic Muniz. He's a photographer and a multimedia artist from Brazil. He's our contemporary. And he is best known for recreating classical works of art and modern painters. But they are not just a mere replica. Among his unconventional materials, you can find all the food stuff you may have in your pantry, like from ketchup to chocolate sauce, peanut butter and jelly. So he also uses dust and dirt and recyclable materials. And in 2008, he undertook this very grand project in a wasteland of Rio de Janeiro. He recreated works of classical masters in trash. So just imagine this kind of a pageant of the masters, but in trash material. And this project was to raise the awareness of urban poverty and environmental degradation, and to preserve his own creations because they were temporary creations. He wanted to preserve them, to record them, and he started taking photographs of his own work. So this is how he emerged as a photographer. And his understanding of the impermanence of all things around us, including fine art, it really informed his creative process, including even his cloud watching. So here's his photograph that is part of the exhibition, and it's called Cloud Study. And you perhaps noticed that it is titled after John Constable. So I would like you just have a brief look at the work that Muniz recreated. So it is John Constable Cloud Study taking in 1822. John Constable was English landscape painter in the Romantic tradition. So between 1821 and 1822, he took more than 100 cloud studies, recording a meteorological sort of activity in the sky, movement of the clouds, shapes, forms. But he acknowledged that the main purpose of the studies was to convey an emotional sentiment in his landscapes. So now back to Muniz's cloud study. As you see, he reimagines the constable, but he creates a convincing study, but His colors are very saturated. The palette is very rich. And the painterly sky shows this very dramatic activity in the atmosphere. However, perhaps you've already noticed the kind of crumbly texture on his image. So he created this study with the color powdered pigments or powdered color pigments. So hence those little tiny particles that you see. And just think of maybe another example, like a Tibetan mandala or Hindu rangoli, those works that are created and immediately after completion, they are destroyed. So the nature of Muni's cloud study was very temporary. He was well aware of it, and so he photographed it to document the process and the result. And so he's just recording the physical world, including his art. And his creative process can also be seen as the interconnection of artistic tradition and his own experimentation. So, and with this, I would like to conclude our brief tour, and I hope it helped to illustrate the variety of photographic styles and aesthetics that are represented at the Masters of Photography exhibition. I hope it stimulated your appetite, and as soon as the museum opens, you will go and see them in person. And maybe also you will follow us on online and attend one of the virtual tours in December. Thank you for your time and for your unwavering support of our museum. And if you have any questions, you are welcome to ask them. And if I have good answers or honest answers, I'll be pleased to convey them to you. And if I won't be able to answer the questions, then please forward them to Dr. James Grebel, and we will be happy to do some research and reply back to you.
So do we have any questions for Marina? Just compliments, Marina. So it looks, thank you very much. Dee?
Yes, thank you. Let's see. So yes, thank you so much to both of you. Marina, really, thanks for your overview and a peek into the Garner collection. We hope we can get there really soon. And to both of you, Scott and Marina, your talk today really highlighted for us the way photography dramatizes the ordinary world for us. I, for one, in Scott's presentation, was fascinated by that, the palladium paper negatives. It gave me a new insight into the whole process. So thank you all again. I thank you very much for being here. I do invite you to use our website to get answers to your questions, to visit Scott's wonderful website. The link is probably still in the chat room. And to remind you that we will see you in the new year. In January for our next presentation. Dr. Christian Kleinbuch will be talking about naturalism in the Italian Renaissance. And that lecture in the new year is in January. Remember, we break for December, January 15th. Please, I look forward to seeing you all. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for support of the San Diego Museum of Art. Good afternoon.
And thank you.